Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2016 Global Dialogue on Waste. We're proud to be disseminating knowledge and expertise through the global dialogues consecutively for the third year. Our audience and our community has been growing steadily, and thanks to more than 100 experts from around the world. And today's panel is being organized as part of the theme called Making a Case for Waste, curated by Mike Webster from Wasteaware UK. And today we'll discuss international donor funding in waste management. And to do that, we have Marcus Lee from World Bank, David Lerpieniere, a researcher at University of Leeds and an independent waste management consultant, and Andy Whiteman, who's the head of RWA Advisors. And before we start the discussion, let me mention two reasons why international cooperation is crucial in waste management. One is our moral sense. Our fellow human beings are deprived of clean air, water, and surroundings, and improving waste management improves all of them and also improves their well-being. And two is pollution caused by improper waste management impacts all of us, whether that is happening in the country we live or not. If one country is openly burning their waste on the streets or at a landfill, the pollution is carried by winds beyond any national borders. And the plastic waste that could not be managed by one country ends up on all our beaches and also introduces toxins into our fish, which swim beyond borders. And finally, the methane released by waste in one country worsens climate change, which, as you might have observed, is already impacting all of us. So whatever your reasons, there is a necessity for more international cooperation in waste management. Now, so with this, let's begin our panel today. And I'll ask Andy Whiteman to introduce himself first.
Hello, everybody. Yes, my name's Andy Whiteman. I've been working in waste management in developing countries for 27 years now. I'm currently working on national sector programs and also local level programs on the implementation as well as policy and programming side, mostly for international finance.
Dave, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ranjith, and it's a pleasure to be participating in the panel today. So my name is David Lerpieniere. I'm an independent consultant, so I work with local government in low, middle, and high-income waste management services. And I'm also a part-time researcher with the University of Leeds, where I'm affiliated to the Institute of Public Health and Environmental Engineering, part of the civil engineering department. And my particular interest is, research interest is how improving waste management services can help contribute to development objectives, particularly looking at the wider economic case, the costs and benefits of improving waste management systems in that context. Thank you.
Great. Marcus?
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Marcus Lee. I'm currently with the World Bank's Indonesia country program based in Jakarta. I just moved here about 3 months ago. Before this, I was based with the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Most of my work program now focuses on Indonesia, but for the past, I would say, about 6 years, I've been spending roughly about half of my time working on solid waste related work for the World Bank in different parts of the world. And I do continue to have an interest on solid waste management issues as they pertain right now, in particular to the East Asia and Pacific region.
Great, thank you. And so let's begin the discussion with questions. And Andy, if we follow the money in international development finance, solid waste management gets only 0.25% of all development finance. And this was data from Dave's paper, and this data is from 2011. And does that suggest the priority of waste management as an issue, just getting 0.25% of all development finance? And if not, what amount do you think will justify the need for waste management in developing countries?
Yeah, I think when we look at the hard numbers, and we look at the relevance to the local levels, we find that there's a imbalance between the allocation of finance from the international development community as opposed to what we see at the local level when we're actually working on the ground. We find that the demand from municipalities in particular and other regional governments, national governments, but particularly the demand from the local level is extremely strong. and this is certainly not matched by a level of activity in the international development sector. There is a lot of activity for technology promoting companies, and wherever we go in our work, there's always 5 or 6, if not more, technology companies which are promoting what may or may not be a good idea, quite heavily financed by, I suspect, by equity capital. Doesn't the level of financing certainly doesn't reflect the doesn't help that battle to be balanced well, in my opinion. On the 0.25% issue, I think there's a lot also, perhaps, and I don't know whether Dave would be. I'm sure Dave would be the best person to clarify on this one. But there's also a lot of waste management activity in other types of program which are not necessarily called waste, in governance programs, in health related programs, and inter-service utility programs. Often waste management is seen as a very visible and practical activity, and is implemented under the frame of other types of program as well. So the number might be higher than that in practice.
Great. And Dave, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I mean, picking up Andy's last point, yeah, in terms of the proportion of development finance that is focused on solid waste. I mean, it's probably worth just explaining that my colleagues and I at Leeds, working with David Wilson at Imperial College as well, when we analysed the level of development finance that was focused on solid waste, we actually reviewed something like 4,000 different projects to really try and identify what proportion was focused on waste management as an issue, and recognising the fact, as Andy rightly points out, that waste management quite often links with other issues. It's quite often part of sanitation, broader sanitation projects in a development context, quite often part of governance or more environmental protection projects. So it's quite difficult to really pick out exactly how much finance is focused on solid waste, but we did our best with the data we had from the OECD. So I think Andy's right. It's probably a bit of an underestimate, but we're confident it's not too far off. Just thinking in terms of the level of finance that development finance that solid waste gets. I mean, clearly it's around the 0.25, 3.3% mark. Know how much it should receive, because clearly donors and recipient governments and local governments are under all sorts of pressures. They have lots of different priorities that they need to meet, whether they should prioritise health over environment, over education, etc. etc. It's a very difficult challenge, but clearly waste as an issue cuts across lots of different aspects of a community in terms of the negative impacts, their impacts on health and the local environment, but also in terms of job creation and the positive benefits of improving waste services. So I think there's a good argument there that it should receive perhaps a greater focus. Whether that means more finance or not is maybe a different question. And it's also worth highlighting that the Global Waste Management Outlook that was published last year by UNEP, working with the International Solid Waste Association, actually called for something like a 10-fold increase in development finance focused on waste, looking to increase it to something like 3% over the next 15 years. And clearly that's their position on this matter, so they're arguing for a greater focus as well.
Great. And Marcus, so we're talking about the aspect of the amount of financing that goes to waste management. What's your day-to-day experience in it? Do you think it's enough, given that waste cuts across so many different issues like health, sanitation, etc. And how do you deal with the amount of financing in the World Bank?
Yeah, thank you. I just to respond, or just to comment on that point about how much is actually being invested or being spent. through various financing sources on solid waste. I think one of the things I've noted always in working in solid waste, especially when it specifically municipal solid waste, is that it's often the largest expenditure or budget item for many municipal governments. It's not unusual to see that solid waste is these, if you kind of break it down, it's the largest single item on municipal budgets. So, and that's not surprising given that in most places or most countries, it's usually a municipal level responsibility. But in terms of where the sort of financing and sort of development corporation funding is coming from, I do agree that it's a very small percentage of the total financing flows. I was just looking at the World Bank's own numbers. We did in recent years we've updated a portfolio review, or basically a review of the entire portfolio of solid waste investments that the World Bank has financed since the year 2000, and it sounds sizable. If you look at the 15 years, it's a cumulative investment of about $3.9 billion in solid waste. However, that's in comparison to overall commitments of the World Bank. I mean, for investment projects for both IBRD and IDA of around $35 billion a year. So 3.9 billion over 15 years is probably just about 1%. If you look at an average commitment of about 35 billion per year in total for all of the World Bank investment projects. I have to say, of course, that the annual the total annual commitments of the World Bank, of IBRD and IDA, it fluctuates from year to year. It just it depends on a number of different factors. So I think it is a small fraction, but I would say at least with most of the multilateral development banks, I think one of the key factors is the client demand, right? So it's what the governments and our development partners are asking for. We obviously, avoid, what you would describe as sort of donor-driven projects. And so I think this also reflects the relative priorities that national and sometimes subnational governments place on, just in terms of what they're using the MDB financing for. Mm-hmm. One other point I'd just like to make before I stop is also to note that one thing we noticed in the portfolio review is that most of the solid waste investments done through World Bank projects tend to be as part of projects that are investing in other things. It's not very common to see what we would describe as a pure solid waste project. So it's usually a municipal services project or an environmental infrastructure project, which then allows us to sort of also address solid waste issues and and then invest in solid waste. But let me stop here. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you. And Dave, so for World Bank, most of the projects are client-driven, from the cities and the governments. But is that the case with most of the other donors out there?
In terms of driven by the client of the development finance, is that what you mean, Ranjit?
Right. I mean, yeah.
I think it's difficult to say, really. I mean, clearly it's a complex context in terms of relationships between the multilateral funders, the multilateral development banks, and also the bilateral donors. So national donors, and that'll be driven in terms of the bilateral donor situation. It'll obviously be driven to a certain extent by the links they have with recipient countries and maybe particular relationships they're looking to support. So it's not really I think it's too complex a picture in terms of who's driving that relationship, but clearly that are particular things, and also driving national and local governments to seek support. It's worth highlighting in terms of how development finance operates. I mean, broadly speaking, you can divide development finance down into to grants without the expectation that it'll be given back. So it's often given to support small investments or to provide technical support. And then there's lending. So essentially loans that are given. Clearly, in this context, the concessional rate is commercial bank lending rates. So there are two very different types of lending. We're trying to highlight the difference between grant funding and lending from donors.
Yeah.
So essentially, it's quite important to recognise that those are, broadly speaking, the two types of development finance that are provided by donors. That grants tend to be smaller, and then it tend to be, maybe in some cases much bigger than that. But grants tend to be focused on smaller projects, smaller issues, support. Where it is obviously development banks at concessional rates that are much less rates, and they will often be focused on infrastructure. In the context of the last 10, 15 more years, there's been a history of providing lending to support the development of landfill disposal sites for community. Properly engineered landfill disposal capacity.
Right. So, just to summarize what you said, grants are generally focused on small projects, and lending is focused on long-term, large projects, infrastructure projects.
That's right. Yes, it's obviously quite a complex picture, but yeah, broadly speaking, that's the way. Right.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Great. So, Marcus, and so you're talking about how for the World Bank, how the financing is based on, is driven by demand from your local partners. So, in general, which aspects of waste management attract most funding? Or what kind of for what kind of aspects are local governments asking for most funding in your portfolio?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say, and I think I would just like to also to link this back to some of the points that Dave was just making as well, which is sort of the distinction between grants and loans and what the funding is used for. I would say that most commonly with a World Bank investment project, which is a loan project, it's always easier for an institution like the World Bank and for the government, the client government that we may be working with, to think about the loan as a source of financing for investments in infrastructure or in large equipment. By that I mean sanitary landfills, large transfer stations, but also collection equipment, right? So, for example, a fleet of new waste collection trucks. The other thing, though, that I've become very sensitive to, for the projects I've worked on, is that oftentimes, though, the challenge for financing waste or for financing sustainable and really good outcomes in waste management isn't so much in the capital or the investment costs. It's actually on the ongoing operational costs. That's where the real challenge is, in my view. And so, sort of sustainability of good outcomes in the sector, and by that I mean specifically financial sustainability, really needs to look at the operational costs. And so it wouldn't be a very well designed project if all the project did was basically to finance upfront the capital costs of a large sanitary landfill, if there was sort of no sort of well thought out system for which the ongoing costs of waste collection would be financed sustainably by the municipality or by whoever was responsible for it. Having said all of that, I think if I look at World Bank projects, I would say, yeah, I think many of them tend to finance sort of conventional investments in infrastructure and in solid waste infrastructure. I mentioned some of those already, for example, landfills and also sort of collection equipment. What we often try to do when we structure a project is to address some of the sort of broader sort of sectoral, institutional, and management issues in the sector. And so oftentimes you may see a project which has components which look at strengthening the operations or strengthening the capacities of the of the government or the municipality in managing the sector, including coming back to this financial sustainability point, including, for example, in fee collection, for example. So if they were able to increase the rate of fee collection, then that would help provide an ongoing and sustainable stream of revenue to cover the operational costs. But I would also say that it's not common to see full cost recovery in the sector. So very often the municipality is likely to have to provide some form of subsidy for the total costs of the managing the solid waste collection system.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because in my research, in my early research in India, we found that many landfills were financed for the capex, but then there was no financing for the opex, and therefore in 1 or 2 years, the landfill, which was so much money was put into it, and all of a sudden it becomes a dump site back again, without much operating expenses, getting into that. So I think that definitely gives us a segue to talk about the results-based financing, and I'll get back to that once we ask Andy on what he thinks about what we're discussing. Andy, so which aspects of waste management do you think attracts most funding, and is that likely to change?
Well, it's not just about the investment financing from the international development community, and from I think we should realise that donor funding can only really be a drop in the ocean of the overall investment demand that's required and needed to scale up services and to improve the quality of services to a level which can be sustained by the cost recovery and the socio-economic situation of the particular locality or country. So I mean, what we working on is packages of technical assistance with investment financing, and a lot of the technical assistance focus is about what does it take to open up investor confidence from the domestic private sector. And that investor confidence is, ranging from micro enterprises all the way up to national, developing a national sector of investors that are for treatment facilities for diversion of waste from landfill, which will be significantly more possible if they can be geared to a level of cost which is affordable in the local level. So I think in terms of attracting financing, I think we have to. I'd like to just bring in to add on to what has already been said, that I think we need a lot more work on the framework conditions, on technical assistance and support to helping countries to develop their own framework conditions which suit their own environments, and using investment capital finance from international financing institutions as a confidence building measure rather than as an absolute solution, because I don't believe that the pace of that investment is quick enough to keep pace with the massive upscale in demand. Mm-hmm. So we have to look for what is required in the framework to open up confidence, and of course that confidence, when it comes to the private sector, as has been correctly pointed out, is about security of payment and about the competency of the client bodies which they are working to, which is a very tricky area when a lot of the decision takers that we work with in the field believe that waste is a golden resource which basically delivers. People should be paying to take their waste away from them. So there's a mentality switch there, which is part of the discussion.
Okay. All right. Great. Great. So, Marcus. So, Andy was mentioning that most of it's also important to have technical capacity building and the catalyzing, using the international finance. So, and technical capacity building is a significant portion of international donor funding in waste management. So, what are your experiences with with that, and let's also talk a little bit about results-based financing, and if technical capacity building is a project that you would be financing, what kind of results will you be looking at?
So I think on capacity building, I think to me, I think one of the main things to bear in mind is that ideally, and maybe this is stating the obvious, but it really should be tailored to the specific needs of the municipality or of whoever it is, who requires some of that capacity building help, and it varies. It really varies from place to place. In some lower income countries, which are very sort of constrained environments, and I'm thinking of examples of World Bank projects in Liberia, for example, which was sort of recovering from conflict, or in the West Bank, where there are particular challenges with the political situation. The capacity needs there would be quite different from a middle-income country like Indonesia, where I work now, where of course Indonesia still has a ways to go to get to where it wants to be eventually. But in the larger cities, especially, you might have greater levels of technical capacity among the government officials, for example. So I think the general principle I would mention is that this really sort of needs to be customized to the specific needs in each location or each city or country. Having said that, I think the other point, and to talk about results-based financing or to sort of switch to that point a little bit. One is, so at the World Bank, we've been working in recent years to try and apply what we call sort of RBF approaches in the solid waste sector. The results-based financing has been used in a number of other sectors, specifically as OBA or output-based aid in a number of sectors, for example, in water supply, with some very good results, and a lot of lessons have been learned from there. And so the challenge or the question to us was, well, how might we apply some of these same principles in the solid waste sector? Now, one place where we've been working recently has been in Metro Manila in the Philippines, and there the project that we're preparing right now, which is actually part of a broader flood management project for Metro Manila, has a component on solid waste, where we've tried to build in some results-based financing aspects into the design of the solid waste component of that project. But it also has, as part of it, a lot of capacity building aspects to it. So there are some parts of the solid waste component which are specifically to support the Metro Manila Development Authority, which has a Metro Manila-wide mandate to manage solid waste. But a lot of the basic solid waste services, so primary collection, for example, is at the sort of local or neighborhood level at what's called the barangay in the Philippines, and then the secondary collection of operating collection trucks, for example, is usually contracted out to a private company, but that's actually the responsibility of the municipal level. So at each of these levels, you'll find, again, sort of different capacity building needs, right, between the MMDA at the metropolitan level, the municipalities, and then at the local or neighborhood level, in this case, the barangays.
All right. Andy, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean that's all great points there, and but I still come back to the issue of when we're talking about results-based financing. Okay, I'll try to make a point on that. It takes a tremendous amount of patience to get waste management related projects up off the ground and successful. The complexity of the subject is quite intense, makes it a fascinating subject to work in. But the amount of stakeholders we're dealing with are very broad, and often with switches in personnel, which are at senior levels in government on a very regular basis. It makes it an extremely frustrating field to work in, but nevertheless one where we just have to show a lot of perseverance. So I don't know what time frame for the results would be set for the payment mechanisms on the performance side, but it's a lot of hard graft has to go in to certainly in the work that we tend to focus on the framework conditions to open up. Now measuring that performance. Okay, there's been various efforts through the benchmark indicators, the Wasteaware ISWM benchmark indicators, to start to try and consolidate and establish a standard way of assessing the sector. Nevertheless, the complexity is quite high. We're not talking about laying X amount of kilometres of pipe. Waste management involves people, and therefore the complexity of the subject make it tricky. But nevertheless, with the up curve of carbon-based financing that we expect over the next period of time, then people are working on it.
Great, thank you, Andy. Dave, do you have any comments on what we've been discussing? And once you're done with that, could you also tell us a little bit about which organizations are active in funding solid waste management?
Sure. I mean, yeah, just sort of reiterating what Andy just explained and Marcus was highlighting as well. I mean, the concept of integrated solid waste management, ISWM, which is the sort of framework that I'm sure all of us are familiar with, and many of those listening will be familiar with. It just shows how complex an issue delivering successful waste management services is. It's not just about physical infrastructure. It's not just about collection services. It's about the institutional arrangements. It's about the interface with the users of the service, the public, essentially. It's about finance arrangements, ensuring sustainable finance. And Marcus highlighted the challenges associated with actually getting cost recovery, and that absolutely it's very, very difficult to achieve high levels of cost recovery for waste services. So there's really that need for that cross subsidisation of service cost. So it's an issue with many dimensions, which, as Andy was saying, it makes it very interesting to work in. But I think to me that kind of highlights a bit of a time frame issue, and I think this is something that donors in particular are really challenged by, because clearly quite often grants in particular will be over a relatively short timescale. It might be 3 years over which a grant-funded project might be expected to be delivered, funded, and complete. And clearly, when we're dealing with a complex issue like solid waste management, it takes a long time and a lot of patience and perseverance and tenacity to really get to a point where the institutions that are necessary are in place, that the level of public engagement that's needed has been started and ramped up to build up a public awareness of the need for effective waste management and recycling services, say, and the mechanisms needed to finance it in the long term exist. So 3 years is really it's a very, very short time frame to really achieve any of that realistically. So I think one of the biggest challenges sort of going forward is going to be how we make sure that all these thousands of projects, whether they're grant funded or loan funded or from philanthropic organisations working in the sector, how they build the legacy and improve things going forward, because there is that risk And I know that there's lots of anecdotal stories of projects where there's been funding injected, maybe a new landfill's been developed, but because there isn't a sustainable finance in place, that landfill will essentially fall into disrepair and become a more like a dump site. To give an example, so that is one of the biggest challenges I think that the donor community in particular faces, is how to achieve sort of long-term sustainability for these projects. And I know that colleagues in development banks and donors are all working hard to try and overcome those issues, and maybe results-based finance has a role to play there. Now, remind me, you wanted me to move on and talk about who's active in the sector. Well, I mean, as Marcus highlighted earlier, I think the World Bank is particularly active, as you would expect, in supporting solid waste-focused initiatives, often as part of larger investments and activities. But it's right up there in terms of one of the largest in terms of proportion of funding focused on solid waste management. I mean, other multilateral developments are also focusing on it because it's clearly a key municipal service. So it's really a key issue that gets lots of support from the likes of the Asian Development Bank. In terms of bilateral donors, I think Germany and Japan are actually the ones that appear to finance solid waste-related activities to the greatest extent. So it clearly aligns with their international development priorities. So, and I think it's also worth highlighting that we have seen, encouragingly, an increase in both the quantum, the amount of development finance focused on solid waste, and the proportion. So the proportions increased from something like 0.1% up to 0.3% over the years up to 2012, and the best estimate is that it was maybe less than 200 million of funding in 2003. It's well over 500 million a year funding on solid waste in 2012, and it looks like that's increasing. We're revisiting those figures at the moment, so it looks like that trend is increasing, and the level of support that solid waste is growing. So I think that's encouraging. Clearly, the argument that solid waste is a key service to support is being made successfully to an extent, I think.
Great, thank you. So, Marcus, do you have any comments on what we've discussed until now? We're coming towards the end of the discussion, so.
Yeah, maybe I should just say a bit, sort of pick up on some of what Andy and Dave were mentioning as well. I think, at least from our view, in the community of practitioners, which is actually not very large, within the World Bank, who are working on results-based financing in solid waste, I think it's still a relatively untested sector. So there have been a number of different schemes or designs which have been are being tested, which have been designed and which are still, sort of being tested. They are being implemented in different countries and in different parts of the world. But I think it will, at least be another couple of years yet before we're able to do a really good sort of ex post evaluation of how well these various schemes performed, and if they didn't perform so well, why not? Why not? And what are the lessons we've learned from that? I completely agree with one thing Andy mentioned just now, which is that a lot of this is it takes time. It's not something which can be done overnight, and it really requires sort of a strong commitment to really sort of stay the course and to keep on plugging away, even if you don't actually see sort of the quick results or quick wins, because solid waste is a difficult sector, and many of the challenges are not easy. I would mention though that one of the aspects of the results-based financing designs that have been tried is to, in fact, and this is to tie it back to the operational financing, is in fact to measure increases in fee collection as one of the results which are being sought. So the GPOBA, the Global Partnership on Output-Based Aid, has offered subsidies in these OBA projects in solid waste in Nepal and also in the West Bank. But one of the indicators which upon which the OBA subsidies are based on is in fact for the municipalities to increase the amount of fees that they're collecting. And so the idea there is to provide the incentive for increased fee collection, and to with the expectation or the hope that if fee collection is increased, that in the longer run this would provide sort of a more sustainable form of financing for the solid waste operations in the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And Andy, so we're almost coming towards the end of the discussion. So do you have any concluding remarks about international donor funding overall, what you've seen in your experience?
Tying things together, I mean, I think there's pretty much a rule of thumb now that as a proportion of household expenditure, that a reasonable amount of expenditure on integrated waste management services is on or around 1% of household income. You can divide that in different ways and calculate that in different ways, but on or around that. Now, I would suggest that I would try to design systems to 0.5% of household income, reflecting the difficulties in actually securing revenue and the priority of having a sustainable project, which means jacking down some of the technologies, some of the sophistication, really bringing things down to earth in reality. So if we bounce that back conceptually in terms of the percentage of the international financing that's provided. So how about we set a target of 0.5% for the next few years to raise to that level, but if we get up to 1%, it would be reflective of the actual demand at the local level, and therefore a bit of a marriage between global policy and local reality.
Right, yeah, great proposal. Marcus, your concluding remarks?
I don't really have much more to add, I think, except again just to reiterate that I think there's obviously still a lot of work to be done, and that but I do hope that if we're able to derive some really good lessons with how best to apply results-based financing in the solid waste sector, I think that would go a long way to addressing some of the challenges, particularly with the long-term sort of financial sustainability of solid waste operations, and not so much on the capital investment side. Thanks. Right,
great. And just want to add that the timelines, like Andy mentioned, in financing waste is extremely important, because waste generally is in countries where even the collection infrastructure is not properly available. Waste is a problem which takes a few decades to solve, and the senior officials change every 3 years, and they're rotating around a specific country, like the commissioners of a city, for example, and it's really difficult to focus. Structure financing in such a way that you can get results from that specific city when the leadership is changing so frequently. So it's more complex than what we've discussed today, but I hope you'll, the audience, all of you, will look for additional resources and then to understand this issue. So Dave, your concluding remarks?
Okay, can you hear me okay now, Ranjit?
I think this is better, slightly better, but please.
Okay, I'll keep them short. It's just to say capacity. I think it's about improving skills and capacity at local level, but also at the in terms of other practitioners as well, because it's not just about local government officers, although they are the ones often charged with delivering the service. It's about support network to support them to do an effective job. So I think that's key. It will always be important to continue to build that capacity in a sustainable way.
Okay, great, wonderful. So to summarize what Dave said, he says building capacity is key to international development, to improve waste management through international development, and capacity not just for the municipal commissioners and the cities, but also building a support network. Building capacity to build a support network is also important. So everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. And please stay updated with our website and social media to know more about upcoming sessions. But today we had a panel from around the world. Andy was joining from Cairo, Dave was joining from UK, and Mark is joining from Indonesia. So despite all of this, despite the technical difficulties, I think we had a good panel. The video will be edited and it'll be presented to all of you soon. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Thanks to the panelists.